Hello.
All right. Hi, everyone. How's everybody feeling? 4 o'clock. Did you get a coffee, microdose, something to keep you going here through the afternoon? All right. Well, we're super excited to chat with you all today, go on a little journey. How many of you all remember this children's story called Harold and the Purple Crayon?
I can see some hands.
All right, there's
Nice.
some hands, and I know there's people who have read it and just don't bother raising your hand. I'm one of those in the audience sometimes too. If you haven't read this classic story, that's totally okay. We are going to give away the ending of the story, so there's going to be a spoiler here, but it doesn't ruin it. But this idea, Harold and his magic purple crayon, this really came from Don in a conversation that we were having a few months back, and he was describing, I was asking him, how do you use AI? How do you think about this tool? And he's like, John, I think about it as my magic purple crayon. And it really resonated with me, and even over the last couple days here at the conference, as I've been attending different sessions on AI, reading the news, there's a lot of doom and gloom and fear around AI right now. And rightfully so. There's a lot of really serious things at stake. In presentations I've been at today, there's been flames and there's been killer robots, and we have concerns about, where's the ethics around in this? Who's controlling it? Those are all really important things. They need to be at the forefront of all of our conversations about AI. But today, for the next 40 minutes or so, I'm going to ask you to look at AI more through the lens of your inner child, to think about it in terms of play, in terms of imagination, in terms of possibilities. And that's why Harold and his purple crayon are so important for our conversation today, is because that is really the metaphor that we want to think about as we think about it as a tool for creative problem solving. So with that, I want to give Don first the opportunity to introduce himself and the amazing work that he does.
Hello, everybody. My name's Don Allen Stevenson III. I kind of, in the creative technology space, try to use a lot of new cutting-edge tools, make them accessible, make them fun. I guess by day I'm doing a lot of work in the AI and animation space as a creative AI pipeline director. But I also like to have a lot of fun educational content and really make AI as a tool set way more approachable. So today you'll hear a bunch of different tools. I'm going to list things that I'm actually using right now, and I want it to be like tangible stuff.
Awesome. And I'm John Scott. I'm a head of learning design and strategy at Masterclass at Work. If you're familiar with Masterclass, we've been around now for almost a decade, producing video-based classes with the world's best, covering a range of topics from acting to filmmaking to writing, to personal growth, to a generative AI class that features Don as an instructor. I'm actually celebrating this year my 20th year in the field of education. I started off as a public school teacher in New York City, working with incarcerated juveniles, and working with those students, learning about the world that they lived in inside of these facilities. One of the things that amazed me was the incredible creativity that they were able to apply to survive in an environment full of constraints and a lack of autonomy. This sort of creativity, the perseverance, the resilience that they demonstrated are lessons that I carry with me and that I think about as we talk about AI. So we wanted to start off in the spirit of kind of creative problem solving with a little bit of a puzzle here. So you'll have to sort of maybe use your fingers to try to solve this puzzle in the air. But can you connect all 9 of these dots with just 4 lines without lifting up your pen or your finger? So I see some people in there kind of trying to map it around. Maybe some of you have seen this puzzle before. Anybody able to solve the puzzle? Anybody, you want to shout out what you did?
What do you got?
I see you mapping it out. Yeah, so the way to do this, well, actually, I'm not going to explain it. I have somebody that's much better at explaining this puzzle than me. His name is Bill Nye. You might be familiar with Bill. And Bill's going to talk about solving this puzzle, in particular, these sort of the beauty of constraints.
People want to solve problems. That's what we want to do. And you'll hear the expression all the time. Let's just think outside of the box. If you think outside of the box, you'll be creative, you'll solve the problem. Well, I believe that expression is based on an old puzzle that's been around since I was a kid. It looks like this. There are 9 dots arranged in a box. All right, now the rule, the game, is you have to connect all 9 dots with just 4 lines. And let's just say you can't lift your pen, pencil, or stylus off of the page. All right, so let's try it. We get started. We'll go across the top. There's 3 of the dots. Down the side, 3 of the dots. Along the bottom, 3 of the dots. Well, you can't get that last dot on the side and the dot in the middle with just 1 more line. You can't do it. Oh heavens, we are puzzled. We are stuck. But if you try the puzzle again, going outside of the box, you can go like this. Let's go up from the bottom, diagonally to the top, down here along the side. Now go outside of the box. Then come back up across, picking up those 2 dots, and then with just 1 more line, you can get the last dot. Isn't that fabulous? The thinking outside the box comes from the rule, the game, where you're only allowed to have 4 lines of any length. So you got to embrace those constraints and work with them. Constraints are good. They're the rules by which you must play. Think about connecting a bridge from one side of the river to the other. You can't put the bridge just anywhere. It's got to be where the banks will support the ends of the bridge, for example. So constraints are not bad. They just are.
All right, so now you know the etymology around this expression, thinking outside the box. Now, I think it's become a little bit of a tired expression, right? You hear it all the time, people, and he even says it in that Bill Nye tone, like, just think outside the box, right? And I think maybe a more useful way to think about it, I think one that's a little bit richer, comes from Edward de Bono. He's sort of the great kind of theorist, psychologist around creativity. He coined this phrase, lateral thinking. And he's got a great quote to sort of exemplify what this means. He says, "You cannot dig a hole in a different place by digging the same hole deeper." And what he's doing is he's really contrasting this idea of kind of vertical thinking, right? You're in the box, you're in a hole, and you keep going deeper and deeper and deeper. You're trying to figure out a way maybe to plant this tree, plant these seeds, and you're hitting rocks, and you just sort of are persistently like going more deep and deeper in this hole, and you're not getting anywhere. Right? And this idea of lateral thinking is to pull yourself out of that hole and scan the ground around you and find a new place to dig that hole. And I think that there's some really great examples of this when we look in the history of innovation and creativity and problem solving. People who were able to think beyond their sort of disciplinary domain, their kind of immediate depth of expertise, and think more broadly, bring in different subjects. And a great example of this, a kind of classic story from Steve Jobs. Jobs was sort of had just dropped out of college. He was sort of floating around. He wasn't constrained by a major. He was kind of exploring the world. And he decides to take a calligraphy class. Right? He was sort of fascinated by the beauty of the typography and the calligraphy. And then years later, when he's starting Apple, he brings what he learned about calligraphy into the typography, into how they thought about design, how they thought about making a beautiful machine. And it's such a great example where here was this random thing that he learned about that became a signature for what Apple became, not only from a product perspective, but from a brand perspective around elegance and beauty and design. And it's such a good example in our current moment because I think when you think about generative AI is not necessarily great at lateral thinking. Humans are great at it. Generative AI, because it works from a probabilistic model, right? Once you give it that context, it starts to think about, what is possible within that context, that framing, right? And this is something that I know, Don, you'll talk a lot about. Once you give it that context, though, right, it's bound within the context. And so your job as the human is to move laterally, to disrupt it, and to allow it to open your world in new ways. And I think this is so relevant to the world we're living in today. So this is from the World Economic Forum. These are the top 8 sort of core skills from a survey of various employers. And if you look across this list, I mean, they just all align so closely to this idea of creative problem solving. Because when we think about this moment of accelerated technological disruption, when we think about a world of uncertainty, the only thing that is certain is that you're going to have new sorts of problems, new sorts of challenges every day, and this is our opportunity to apply these skills and this mindset in order to solve problems creatively. And so this starts to think about what is the toolbox available to us to solve these problems. And Don, I don't think anybody I know has a richer sort of tool set to work from than you. And so hopefully you can kind of share with us some of the tools that you're using and just how you assemble your toolbox in general.
Yeah, so I like to use a lot of mixtures of tools. And maybe one word I would throw in there is the idea of daisy chaining tools. I think a lot of people might just use one AI tool for their task at hand, but what I like to do is daisy chain them together. So an example of kind of using some in the toolbox, I have a car, and what I'll do is I'll plug in ChatGPT that's running on my phone into the speaker on my car, and when I'm driving to a new place, let's say I'm driving to Yosemite to go on a camping trip, I will ask the car to tell me stuff about the natural formations in Yosemite, and it almost turns it turns the car ride kind of into it feels like a magic school bus in a sense. And as I'm driving places, you can kind of learn about the world, and it's got a conversational nature to it. So you can kind of just keep asking questions, and it'll keep sharing more insights. And that's one tool. But then there's also tools like Claude 3.7, highly recommend. It's great for creative writing, and kind of maybe taking one output from one spot and bringing it into the other might be a pretty useful example. Even these glasses that I'm wearing, I can run AI models on the glasses. So there's no displays in these at this time, but there's little speakers here on the inside, on the side. So you can go around and I can ask questions about the world and then just get the answer kind of quietly right to my ear. So I guess the tools are going to be changing quite a bit, and there's just a few right there.
And I think it's so amazing, Don, the way that you sort of consider what are the constraints of these particular tools, what are they really good at, and using that sort of critical eye to curate and select the tools that are right for the problem that you're trying to solve. And I think that leads us back to this idea of generative AI and this plethora of tools as our sort of magic purple crayon. And Don, I think everybody would appreciate to understand sort of where you came up with this and why it's such a meaningful sort of metaphor and lens on AI for you.
Yeah, so this is my favorite child book, children's book. My grandma would read this to me a lot, and my mom would read it to me a lot. And I just loved it because this is a little kid, and he's faced with all sorts of problems in his world, but he happens to have this magical purple crayon. And so anytime, if he's falling for something, let's say he was falling, he could draw something to help him, like a parachute. Or if he was hungry, he could just draw food, and then he could draw food for others and share it. And just this idea of he would be faced with all the problems of living a life, yet he could tackle that problem better because he had this magical purple crayon. And so, yeah, big shout out to my grandma and my mom for reading me this book because it's my everything.
And it's so beautiful to just think about AI as this sort of companion on your journey, something that's sort of helping you get out of a tight spot, to reimagine something, to see the world in a different way. And so with that, we want to think about sort of 5 transformations. And we're going to talk about some sorts of skills, mindsets, that really precede the dawn of Gen AI. Right? These aren't new skills, but they're, I think, of increasing importance today, and they're interesting to think about through the lens of AI, how you can leverage these tools in order to build and activate these skills and mindsets. The first one is really focused around curiosity. You know, in the book, the first thing that Harold does is he looks out the window and he sees darkness and he wants to go on this adventure. And so what does he need? He needs a source of light to guide him on his journey. And so the first thing he draws is the moon. And so making the moon to illuminate your path of curiosity is really important. And to talk a little bit about kind of what curiosity means, why it's so important, I think a person here who, again, going back to children's storytelling and the imagination, LeVar Burton, the host of the very famous show Reading Rainbow, is going to talk about what he believes are the 2 most powerful words, or the most powerful phrase in the English language.
Thank you very much.
Ready? I believe that 2 of the most important words in combination in language are what if. Because by accepting that invitation into the what if, everything becomes possible. And so after that question, in the exploration of that question, all things become possible. There's a tendency that we have as human beings to encourage an investigation into the what if when we're children. But we remove permission as we get older to imagine and to investigate that what if. I believe that we need to maintain contact with that inquiry. We need to maintain our contact with our imaginations as we grow up and grow older. I know that my generation is leaving a world full of problems. And I believe that it's going to be incumbent upon this upcoming generation to solve these problems, and chief among the tools that they will need is their imaginations.
So what if, to ask kind of what if, and when we think about curiosity, when we think about Harold drawing his moon, first it takes courage. You know, in our workplaces, to try to foster an environment where people are curious, it requires safety, it requires people to foster that courageousness to go out and explore, to look beyond the immediacy, look beyond their current set of skills, their domain of expertise, and to journey outward. And both to sort of imagine very broadly, but also to dive very deeply. And using AI as a tool to do both of those things is really amazing thing. And I feel like, Don, in terms of kind of curiosity and in kind of how you foster curiosity, how you are in a continuous state of learning by leveraging these tools, maybe you can share an example of kind of how you do that.
I'm trying to think of a good one. I know we had one that was just
I know
backstage.
an amazing one. So you are not a programmer, you are not a roboticist, and yet you have brought a robot to your work.
Yes.
Simply through this mindset of curiosity and lifelong learning.
Yeah, so I got inspired because I saw some like cool robotics video on YouTube, but I don't have a programming background. But there's this new thing called vibe coding, where you can kind of explain the vibe that you're going for to an AI model, and then it writes the code that matches your vibe. So I asked an AI, I would like to build a robot, a tiny one. I have a budget of $50. What is like a robotics kit that I could order online that can help me build a very basic robot? And it suggested a couple options, and then I went and purchased one for $44. And then I didn't know what to do, so I took the phone camera, took a picture of the components in the robotics kit, and I said, these are the components that are in it, and I showed it with like a live camera. Again, I did that with, I think that was with ChatGPT, and it kind of showed it the different, tools. And then it started asking me questions of like, okay, so you could do this with a proximity sensor, you could do this with a light, you can do this with like an Arduino chip. And I said, okay, I want to build a thing where the robot turns to you when you're close, and then it turns away when you walk away from it. And then I said, can you generate for me a list of instructions on how I can start to build that with this like robotics kit? And it did. And then suddenly I needed to code something, and I didn't know what to do, so I said, can you write the code that would allow it to allow the proximity sensor to do that thing? And then it started to work. And now it sits on my desk at work, and when people walk by my desk, this little robot looks at them, and then when they walk away, it goes back to doing its thing.
And it's like, it is one of those just great examples, I think, of bringing up a sense of playfulness to your curiosity, to how you learn. And if you think about what Don was able to do, right, and if you think about it in sort of the evolution of information and learning, right, there was a time when people would have had to gone to the library and used microfiche and used the Dewey Decimal System to look up many books to try to research and understand this. Right? Then you had the information age, which allowed people to go on their computer, scan the web, find articles, spend a lot of time going through that to teach yourself, but it was certainly more convenient than going to the library and going through books. We had this social information age where maybe you could go to a Reddit forum and sort of ask people and try to crowdsource your way to sort of ascertaining this knowledge. And now you have this sort of age of intelligent information where Don has a co-creator, right, who he can ask very specific questions to, get very personalized feedback and advice in order to foster that curiosity, to learn and discover. And
just to add to that, if you have like a question, if you keep showing it, that you're curious about stuff, it kind of starts to learn a little bit that you're a curious person, and it helps, at least for me, gives me like more questions to explore deeper. So it's like, oh, you're interested in this? Have you tried using this? And then it just becomes like this really fun game of exploring. Very
cool. All right, the second principle here: make a dragon. So in the story, Harold is kind of making a forest. And as he's making a forest, he makes himself an apple tree. And the tree is full of these delicious apples. And sort of like a kid with a new toy, his first kind of instinct is that he wants to protect these apples, right? He doesn't want to really share his apples, and he's concerned that other creatures may come and eat his apples. And so he draws a dragon to protect the apples. But when he draws this dragon, he actually becomes all of a sudden very afraid of this dragon, right? Now he's standing next to a dragon, and so he then draws himself a river and jumps into it, and puts himself in a kind of more dangerous situation where he has to now draw himself a boat and kind of get out of this river. But it's probably the most, I think, psychologically complex part of the story, in the sense that he has to sort of confront an aspect of himself in this moment. He was biased towards this idea of possessing the apples, and now he has to kind of confront this fear that he's created. And I think it's a really interesting way to sort of think about how we look at ourselves, how we think critically at the world around us, but also critically at the limitations of our own perspective. And so in this video here, Neil deGrasse Tyson, the astrophysicist and science educator, is going to talk a little bit about confirmation bias, which I think, and what we'll talk about, is so relevant in this age of AI.
It's not our fault that we're human. Being human we all have susceptibility to a certain category of bias. That's called cognitive bias. These are things you think are true, but are not, and can be demonstrated to not be true. You're staring at it barefaced, and you say, I swear to you, this is how it is, and it's not. There are all manner of cognitive biases. There are some that are particularly insidious if you're trying to understand what is objectively true. Of all the cognitive biases that are out there, perhaps I think the most insidious is confirmation bias. What does that mean? There's something I want to be true or that I think is true, and I look at 100 things and I find the 3 things about it that are true, and I say, see, I'm right. Well, how about the 9 out of these 10 that don't agree with you? You don't even notice them. You have devalued them. They didn't even show up on your radar. You remember the hits and forget the misses. That is a flaw in our reasoning. It doesn't just affect any one person, it affects us all. You went right to the thing that agreed with you. And you sat back and said, I'm even more right than I thought I was, because I found something that agrees.
So the most insidious of all the biases, right? Strong. He uses strong words, Neil deGrasse Tyson. But it is really, really important to think about because first, generative AI has been designed to try to please the user, right? And if you do not prompt it, to give you critical feedback, it will ultimately be sort of, obedient to your wishes and really reinforce. Just like algorithms and the kind of echo chambers or the filter bubbles that we talk about there's the same sort of features built into AI that we need to be really conscious about. And there's some pretty interesting research happening in this area. This was a study from 2025. And what the study found was that higher confidence in Gen AI is associated with less critical thinking, while higher self-confidence in yourself and your own abilities is associated with more critical thinking, right? So the idea here is that people who felt confident in their expertise in the area that they were kind of pinging this Gen AI tool, they were able to think more critically about the information that was being generated by the Gen AI. And whereas people who felt less confident in their abilities in that particular domain were more susceptible to sorts of hallucinations and kind of information that may not be as reliable or as credible as you'd like to see. And so this idea of being self-aware, understanding our own knowledge domains, those knowledge gaps, building a broad foundation of understanding across a number of domains, really, really important. And I think, Don, many of us, when we use these tools, we tend to sort of ask it questions to get answers back. But for you, you have coined this phrase, critical thinking mode, and you've actually inverted that paradigm in a really interesting way.
Yeah, so there's a fun thing you can do is, you can go to one of the AI models, and instead of asking your question and getting the answer, you can ask it to only ask you questions and wait for you to answer. So an example would this be like, I wanted to know what were some of my biases, so I asked it to interview me on a set of questions so that it could kind of figure out what my biases are. And then after it did that, I kind of answered its questions, and it got me thinking. I'm like, oh wow, I haven't thought about that before. And like it gave me all these questions that it wanted me to answer. I then gave those answers back, and then asked it to suggest a book for me that has all of the opposite values that I listed. And then I went and bought it and read it, and it was very painful to read because it was everything I'm against. But I just wanted to know, like, wow, there's like a whole other way of thinking that is not my default. And by having the AI ask me questions, it got me to like think out loud. I'm like, oh, I have that bias, I have this bias, and it was just drilling me with questions. So that's like critical thinking mode. It makes you have to think critically, so that because if you just don't use any of your critical thinking, then I think you're using AI in a very negative way, because then you're not helping your own brain. But like if you're saying, ask me questions so that I have to do the critical thinking, I have to do the work, then you get a much better relationship, I would think.
It's such a cool example because it's one of those that I certainly never thought to use the tool in that way. And it's such a unique capability, right, that has only existed in human-to-human sorts of relationships. It's not something that we could do just on the internet where we can ask the internet to sort of ask. I guess you could do it on a forum, but I can't imagine the sorts of kind of comments you would get on a public social media forum.
You say like ask, like when people post that meme where it's like, they say some view and they said, prove me wrong.
Right.
And then everyone underneath the comments kind of explains why they're wrong, in a sense, right?
Yeah, totally. All right, should we go to the next one? So number 3, make a mountain to change your vantage point. So Harold's been on this journey now. He's made a dragon and got scared. He's crossed the ocean, and he's a little guy. He wants to go home now. He's missing his home. He wants to get back to his room, and he's not sure how he's going to get back to his room. So the first thing he thinks to himself is, well, maybe if I go to like a higher elevation, I'll be able to sort of look out and see kind of where my window is and where my home is. And so he starts to draw himself a mountain and climb up the mountain to change his vantage point. And I think this is very similar to that idea of kind of stepping out of the hole and kind of moving across the land, looking for a new hole to dig, that idea of lateral thinking. But it's also this idea that as we are problem solving, as we're trying to find a solution to a really thorny, sticky problem, what we want to do is really pressure test our ideas and our solutions. And one way we can do that, just like he sort of changes his vantage point, he changes his sense of perspective, is by sort of zooming in and out on our solution from a very micro context, how does a solution work in a very micro context, to zooming out to the macro. And this is a technique used by the former PepsiCo CEO, Indra Nooyi. She calls this sort of the act of a telephoto lens. And in her efforts to drive innovation, strategic change at PepsiCo, this was a tool that she used to understand whether or not a solution was a viable way to bring a new product to market. And so she's going to break this down for us.
One of the skills that I practiced through my life is the skill of zooming in and zooming out. Let me talk about what I mean by that. If you say, I want to launch a 50-pack Pepsi, I'm just picking an example. It's easy to say 50-pack, 50 cans in one big package. God, I can price it so that it's compelling and it'll drive a lot of Pepsi sales. So this is an example of an idea at a very high level, zoomed out. But then when you start to go down slice by slice and say, does it make sense? It's a dizzying detail that you have to get into to be able to really understand the business, every aspect of the business. Can we actually make a 50-pack Pepsi on the line? Is a manufacturing line such that it can actually package 50 packs? Can it actually be put on a store shelf? Can a buyer actually buy it and put it on their cart? Does it have room in a refrigerator or a pantry? And how will they dispense from that 50-pack of Pepsi? So every idea you have, you shouldn't just look at it as, oh, what a great idea, I'm going to go make it happen. You've got to look at it through the lens of every function. So if you keep doing this telephoto lens exercise, as I call it, you'll find that your thinking improves. You'll come to a better idea that's implementable and executable by everybody in the organization.
So I love this zooming in and zooming out. And she has another example in the class, which I really love. They were launching a new compostable bag for their potato chips. And they thought, oh, this is going to be great. You know, people are really into the green movement. They want sustainability. We're replacing these, you know, really kind of environmentally unfriendly chip bags with these compostable bags. And they put them out to market, and they're not selling. And the team is scratching their head, and you know, why aren't people buying these chips? Like, it's the same chips, it's just a different bag. They should love the bag. And when they went down to the micro level and started to talk to people, hey, why don't you like the chips? They said the bag is too noisy. That when, you know, you're like, you're in this room, right, and you're trying to like sneak a chip, and the person next to you is like looking at you because you're like crinkling around in this bag and disrupting everybody and making noise in your office, right? I mean, it really is like a social, like, oh, I'm not gonna buy these chips. They make me a social pariah in my cubicle at work. And who would have thought that, right? The designers didn't think about this. The engineers who made it didn't think about this. The CEO who approved it as a strategic vision, right? And it wasn't until they really zoomed down to this micro level to understand why it wasn't working that they were then able to iterate and effectively solve for this noisy bag of chips. And De Bono has this concept, and you've probably heard of this one, called the 6 thinking hats. The idea is that when we're approaching a decision point, or when we're considering a solution, that we actually put on sort of one of these different hats. And each hat represents a sort of different perspective, a different frame of reference to that solution. One may be very analytical, one may be more emotional, right? Whatever those hats are, you put these different hats on, and you suddenly start to get a fuller picture about kind of that solution that you're working on, that you're iterating, or that decision that you have to make. And what I think is really interesting about 6 thinking hats is that it's typically been sort of hard for people to implement this because we may not have the skills to put on the analytical hat very well. We may be very emotion oriented, and wearing that hat is a challenge for us. And so to sort of force ourselves into these roles can be productive, but it can be limiting. But this is where I think Gen AI offers a really amazing opportunity to expand our ability to sort of wear these different hats without necessarily having to bring in 6 different personalities into the room. And Don, I think this is something that you do often in working with AI to come up with creative solutions to problems. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you do that?
Yeah. So you know, looking at these like 6 thinking hats, I often start a conversation with an AI by telling it what hat I want it to wear first. And if you say, okay, your hat I want you to wear is you're a mentor, and then you ask for advice. And then you get a totally different answer than if you just asked the AI for advice. Now you can switch it. You can say, okay, that was great advice from the mentor hat. Let's switch it. Now you're a complaining employee. What would you say to this? And like you kind of hear all these different responses based off of the different hats that you want the AI to wear. For me, like I have to wear multiple hats, so like it's helpful to kind of think of what hats you might need. And when in doubt, you can always ask, what hats am I not thinking of in this problem? And it might suggest like, oh, well, you might want to ask a lawyer hat or a chef hat. And it really just kind of depends on your need. So it's fun. If you can think of hats, I think you get the idea.
Yeah. I'm often finding myself having to put on my legal hat when I'm making these presentations because our legal team is always like, all right, I don't know if you're allowed to use that in a slide. So I try to preemptively, you know, problem solve around that by wearing that legal hat. But I think it's just a great example of our ability to really expand beyond our sort of deep disciplinary expertise and think about the world through these various lenses and frames and perspectives. And it makes that journey that we're all kind of ongoing is more exciting, more interesting, richer in how we think. And
can I add one thing to it?
Yeah, Don, go
I was
for
thinking you can have it, you can describe the hat that you want it to wear. I'm really stuck on this metaphor. I love it. One that I've tried is like when I was trying to improve my writing, I asked it to put on the hat of a really critical editor and critique my work. And like by doing that, it wasn't satisfied with my basic writing. It was like, you need to adjust this and this and this. And I'm like, oh, okay, that hurts, but I get it.
Yeah.
But it's like you're doing it to yourself. So, sorry.
No, but it's such a great, because you have to be willing to ask it to give you that, right? Like you have to have that willingness, because definitely the first time that I was using Claude as a writing partner, I was sharing it paragraphs. I was like, what do you think, Claude? And it was like, your prose are amazing, right? And it was so complimentary, and I was like, man, like I'm an awesome writer. Then I'm like, wait a second, right? And so the bias, right? You're really placating to me. It made me feel like I was the best writer ever. And then I realized, like, I better ask it to be critical. Otherwise, it's not going to be.
You have to be so careful about that. Because, like, if you don't keep asking it to, like, put on a different hat, it might just keep patting you on the back. And you could have a horrible idea. And it's like, that's the best thing I've ever heard. And you're like, thanks, yeah. But, yeah, just, have it, keep asking it to critique your work, too. And throw that in there.
And there's nothing wrong with a little encouragement every now and again, right?
True.
I need a hype man sometimes. So AI can be that hype man. All right, number 4, make a balloon. So little Harold, he's at the top of the mountain. He's peering off, and like all kids, he gets a little careless up there, and suddenly he finds himself in free fall. He's falling through midair. And what does he draw himself? Of course, he draws himself a hot air balloon, and he floats safely down to the ground. And so this idea of making a balloon to improvise and adapt on your journey. And I think this idea of improvisation, adaptability, really, really important when we think about a world that's continuously being disrupted. Technology is accelerating change, and a great way to learn improvisation, of course, is to go to the Masters of Improv. And so Amy Poehler here, of course, Saturday Night Live legend, is going to break down a little bit around improv, the importance of listening, the importance of playing with status in your improv.
If you stay connected and you listen, something very magical can happen, and you should just kind of keep the door open to let it happen. Improv is like kind of this heightened version of listening, because you're like, where are we? What is your name? Are we on the moon? What's happening? You're just, and could you imagine even taking 50% of that into your real life? Who are you to other people? You're relating and being in relation to other people. And playing with status doesn't mean you necessarily have to respect status. It just means being aware of it. This person is the teacher, this person is the student, this person is the elder, this person is the security guard to your teen in the mall. Like, what is status? What does it afford you? What does it keep you from? How do we abuse it? And do you want to pay attention to that in your work and in your art? And do you want to flip it, change it, or just comment on it? Just being aware of status in general, in a room, in your life, at work. Status is really important because you can challenge it, you can play with it, or you can embrace it, you can get into it. And those are things that in improv really help you figure out the scene, they help you find a game, they help you be a good listener, and all that stuff.
So I think when we think about improv, to be improvisational, it's so important to be able to empathize, right? If we're going to take on the role of that character, to understand how they feel, how they think, and that's really important. Empathy in as both an emotional context as well as a cognitive context. That is that we can't just be in relation with someone's emotions, but we have to make an effort to see the world through their eyes, see the world through through their vantage point, what matters to them, how they make meaning in the world. It's such an important part of empathy that I think sometimes we don't think as much about. We think a lot about the feelings aspect, which sometimes puts us further in the spectrum towards being sympathetic. But to empathize is that ability to understand others. And the feeling part and the thinking part really is, I think, uniquely human. I think we're seeing instances where Gen AI can demonstrate empathy for people, but it's a machine, and it's really not feeling that, right? It doesn't have the emotional context around it. It can sort of imagine probabilistically the world of that person, how they make meaning in the world, what matters to them. But this is really uniquely human, and it allows us to, in that moment, to improvise, to adapt, to take on a different role. And I think what it also opens up from a technology perspective is when we're thinking about these sort of hairy social situations that we have to deal with in life, that we have to deal with in work, it's hard to sort of practice and prepare for those situations, right? If you have to have a difficult conversation with someone, you may play out that conversation in your head, but like, how do you really prepare for it? And Don, I think you're doing some interesting things to help you sort of prepare for difficult conversations using AI.
Yeah, the one that comes to mind is like if I'm about to go to a meeting where I have to deliver some not so great news, I will actually simulate that conversation with an AI first, and at the end of the conversation, ask the AI to score how did I do, like in terms of and also you have to give it the context, let it know like what is your status in relationship to the type of communication that you're going to do, and then simulate and I really do mean with your own voice, because a lot of these tools you can actually speak with your voice and then they emit audio back, so you can actually have that dialogue and kind of practice. And at the end, you say, cool, we're done with the role playing. I need you to put on the hat of reviewing that. How did that conversation, how would you rate that conversation? How did I do? And it could be as analytical as you would like it to be. It'll be like, oh, well, you interrupted a lot of times and you spoke this much amount of the time. So maybe when you go to deliver that news, maybe consider, saying less. And it'll give you kind of that feedback, which is pretty sweet. Yeah.
And we have found this is something that we've been exploring at Masterclass at Work to help organizations sort of support the development of these kind of soft, durable skills. And it's been, historically really hard for people to practice these things. HR people, L&D leaders have typically organized workshops where you do live role plays, much like you would see in an improv class where you're going to take on a role. I'm the manager, you're the upset employee, and let's role play that. Let's switch, let's play with status and role play it the other way. But those are hard to coordinate. They can feel awkward, right? If you haven't really done them before, it just feels very forced. So this opportunity to be in this sort of safe, private space with the AI to have this sort of real-time conversation is a great way to develop these skills that, again, have typically been, you're sort of out there on your own, like in the wild, just sort of doing it and building that muscle over time through failure. And failure can be hard for us. Another example that we did that I thought was really interesting as a test, we were working with a healthcare provider, and we wanted to help the phlebotomists develop more empathy and have better interactions with their patients, right? And so we created a scenario where the AI was a sweet grandma who was afraid of needles, and the phlebotomist had to show empathy in order to draw the blood from the patient. And if the phlebotomist sort of lacked empathy, didn't build rapport, didn't help this sweet granny, the granny would sort of shout, "Get me out of this chair," and the conversation would end, and you sort of failed the role play. And it was just a really great way, and the AI, in its own improvisation, was amazing in taking on this role of the grandmother. And if the phlebotomist said, do you have grandkids? What do you like to do with them, and the grandmother would say, I love to make them cookies, and the grandma would get distracted, and then you could get the blood out, and you could like pass the test, right? And so, you know, how do you simulate that? How do you help people develop those skills? Well, this now is a really interesting tool to be able to do that. Okay, the last part of the journey, this is where I give away the ending of the book here. But Harold is, he's getting frustrated. He can't figure out how to get home. And so what he does is he realizes that every time that he looked out the window of his room, he would see the moon. And so he saw the moon up in the sky, and he drew his window around the moon. And he got there by drawing many, many, many windows. He built like a whole city full of windows, relentlessly realizing that none of these were his windows. And it wasn't until he actually sort of looked back and sort of reimagined it, stepped out of the box, thought laterally, thought about that moon, that he was able to land on the solution. And this is so important, this idea of being resilient, of iterating, and particularly with AI. Don, I mean, I think a lot of people sometimes, you put in the prompt, you get the response, you're like, wah, wah, that response sucked. This thing sucks. I'm moving on. What is the right attitude, the right approach to have in using these tools?
Yeah, the main one is iteration. So like most of the times I start a conversation with the AIs, and their first like 30 things are not correct, but like the 31st thing is. So if you like stop, if you like, a lot of people I've seen they'll use an AI tool and it doesn't give them the perfect thing right away, and then they just throw the whole thing away. They're like, oh, it's all bad. It's like, just try a little bit longer, give it another question, give it another, just iterate more. It's kind of like if you're trying to like learn how to draw or something, and or actually no, even better, little kids when they're learning how to walk, if they just like struggled that first time, and then just said, I just can't do it, I'm stopping right there, then they don't. I mean, that's not how babies work. They eventually, can keep trying over and over again. They might bump their head, and it might be uncomfortable when they're trying to like learn how to like get the balance, and they'll take steps, like they have to learn about like equilibrium, but eventually through all those kind of iterations they start to learn how to like put one foot in front of the other, and they can start to like get mobility. So I think a similar thing is true when you're using any of these AI models. Maybe don't give up on it immediately when it fails. Try a bunch of times. And I just remember another thing, go to comedy shows. I just remember from this is not really AI advice, but it kind of is, because with improv, if you want to get better ideas on how to like have improv thinking, attend comedy shows and kind of treat them more like lectures. Like enjoy them, they're fun, they're amazing, but also think of them more like lectures. You're like learning how do they engage with the audience, how do they handle switching contexts, how do they wear different hats. All these kind of techniques together are very helpful in having that iterative approach when you're using any of these cool tools.
And, I think a really great example of being resilient, of kind of pushing an idea, is this story from Richard Branson. Branson, of course, the serial entrepreneur, founder of Virgin Group. This is his story about how he was able to get seat-back videos into planes. And for those of you that traveled here, now actually they've sort of gotten rid of them and you have to use your own device, right? But at the time when we didn't have devices, this was monumental game changer for entertainment on your flights around the world.
We wanted to be the first airline in the world to introduce seat-back videos into the seats of our planes. It was going to cost us about $10 million to do it. We went to the banks, and the banks wouldn't lend us the $10 million. And we were absolutely convinced that seatback videos is what kids would want, what everybody would want. And we wanted to be some years ahead of British Airways, our main competitor. And I remember just lying in bed one night, just looking up at the ceiling, desperately trying to think how we could get $10 million. And then I had an idea, and this was, because it was nighttime, it was on Los Angeles time, so I picked up the phone to Boeing, and I said, I'm thinking of buying 10 brand new 747-400s from you. Would you include the seatback videos in the backs of the seats as part of us buying the planes? And they said, well, we're delighted that you want to buy these planes, and I'm sure that we could organize that. Cut a long story short, we were able to borrow $2 billion to get the planes, whereas we couldn't borrow $10 million for seatback videos. So sometimes, if you think really big, you can actually solve your smaller problem.
So I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, if somebody wrote me a check for $2 billion, I could solve a lot of problems too, right? Well, amazing story of just that, you're locked in, right? You're thinking about like, your mindset is how do I appeal to the banks? How do I convince them to give this 10 million? And then all of a sudden you step out of that hole, you look at it from a different vantage point, and you reframe the problem and you find a solution to it. And so to recap here, I think remember, be curious. It takes courage. Dig deep. Reach wide. Think critically. Draw that dragon. Be self-critical. Use critical thinking. Be aware of that confirmation bias. Shift your perspective. Zoom in, zoom out. Draw your mountain. Be improvisational. Right? When you're falling, make that balloon, empathize to be able to be agile, to shift perspectives, and then most of all, be resilient. The first time it doesn't work, and it's probably not going to work the first time, continue to iterate, continue to refine your approach, and you'll be able to use these tools to hopefully unlock new sorts of creative problem solving in your life and at work. And so with that, I wanted to close with a great quote from Edward de Bono here. If you don't design your future, someone will design it for you. And so think about Harold and his Purple Crayon the next time that you're using these tools in your journey through life. And we thank you so much for joining us today. Again, if you're interested in learning more about Masterclass at Work, what we do for organizations around this, please reach out. And of course, Don is ubiquitous in the world, and reach out to him to learn more about his amazing work. All right, so we've got some questions here. So first question, if AI is the Purple Crayon for creativity, what skills will remain uniquely human in the next 10 to 20 years? So in some ways, I feel like those 5 sort of principal skills that we talked about really are those sorts of timeless skills. Curiosity, the ability to think laterally, as I mentioned, I think is uniquely human. Empathizing with both feeling and thought and understanding. I don't know, any others jump out to you, Don? And
a lot of empathy skills. I mean, you already covered that, but like a lot of person-to-person interaction is going to be increasing in value just because it's something that's very uniquely human. I see another question in there is, how do you, or what are your favorite tools, large language models for the moment, graphics, language, video, sound? So right now, I guess for me, sound, it's like ChatGPT, or I use Suno and Udio to do music generation. I use 11 Labs for generating voices. I use Mary to generate videos, and Sora for videos. There's a lot of good tools. Direct message me on Instagram. I'll send tools to you.
And Don, I think related to that question, one of the things that you do that blows my mind is that you set up your Apple Vision Pro. You've got all the models set up in your Vision Pro, like your sort of advisory board, each model with its sort of own particular kind of capabilities and sort of perspective on things, and that is your board, right? And so that rich box of tools that you have, right? It's less about the favorites and maybe more about like what is the right tool for the right moment.
I agree. I would recommend use them all, experiment, play, be super curious. I think that like we're still in the early times of this space. That's the right answer. I don't want to say it's like the one tool because it's really not. It's all of them. Yeah.
Yeah. How about this one? How do you train AI to select for good taste?
Good taste?
Good taste.
What does that mean?
I guess it's fairly subjective, right?
Oh.
Like what is tasteful? It is great to see at South. I have to say at South by Southwest, we did all of the images here, the Harold Purple Crayon images using generative AI. You're seeing a lot of presentations, I think, using generative AI to create images. It is a step up from the old days when I used to go to presentations and people were like just pulling out like Google image searches that still had watermarks on them and stuff. Do you remember those days? Like, and then there was the moment like last year when people just started using generative AI image tools when you were like, oh my God, they're so tacky, like, and they all like look the same. And I think we're like moving, and I think it's about, like the context that you set, the prompt structure, right, to get to the aesthetic that you have. But I think when we talk about what's uniquely human, it is the taste, right? The AI has no taste. You have the taste. And so, yeah, any other thoughts as we sort of wrap it up, Don?
I mean, we have lots of good resources on the masterclass, so please check it, take a look at the episodes, and then you can also reach out to us all separately too.
Thank you all so much for coming and hanging out.
Thank you.
And enjoy the rest of the conference.